Welcome to Critic's Corner. Today we're going to be talking about a documentary about a man who murdered 36 women across 5 different states. That's right, it's the Ted Bundy Tapes. So, I sat down to watch the Ted Bundy Tapes, and I didn't intend to, but I watched all 6 hours in one go. So I want to start this review by saying that this docu-series made me believe in demons, because they have these cute little interviews with Ted Bundy, and they talk about him, and one of the things that they say in the interviews is when he starts to talk about the killings to the journalists who the docuseries is kind of framed around, they reference how bright and blue his eyes were. And then they said that when he started talking about the series, that his eyes would go black. And they said that, and I went, okay, I'm ready for them to explain a little more. They didn't. His eyes went black. I guess that's just how it is. Demons are real. So, Ted Bundy Tapes. Everybody thinks serial killers are interesting. It's like, what goes on inside their head? It's the reason why psychology is the most popular major in America. But why is a documentary about a serial killer good? Because the Ted Bundy Tapes are good. Well, where it really gets to being interesting, especially as not just the events that took place being interesting, but the actual series itself, is that this series is very non-judgmental. It doesn't take a side. And that isn't to say that it goes, maybe some people kill people to cope. No, it says that killing people is wrong. But what it doesn't do is try really hard to make you understand that killing people is wrong. The series just kind of says, hey, we all know you shouldn't murder tons of people. Let's move on from there. And so then they actually explore some of the internal mechanisms that make people do terrible things like what Ted Bundy did in the 70s. So not only do we get a close-up examination of what goes on inside a psychopathic mind, we also get a really good example of how crappy police work was in the 70s. Because at the time, internet hadn't been invented yet, and so all of the information regarding these murders going on across the United States had to be shared by snail mail or by phone call. And that is something that Ted Bundy was aware of, and it factors into how he went about doing his killing. So what the documentary isn't doing is portraying some venomous story about how terrible this person is from his childhood to his eventual death on death row. It's a look at how the human brain works in sort of a case study, and that case study is this infamous serial killer. The big special wombo combo feature that the Ted Bundy Tapes does is it has the man himself speaking about those actions. So you get his take on his childhood, you get his take on his life around the times the killing started, all the way up through them ending the trial and all the way up through his eventual death. You get his take, but then the reporters who went in and recorded these tapes in order to make a book out of their experience also went and talked to the people who weren't Ted Bundy in those situations. So they got Ted Bundy's story, and they also got the story of the people who were there when it happened. And so we actually see how the mind can fool itself and misremember and selectively remember aspects such as of your childhood. Ted Bundy's childhood, as he remembers it in the series, is really nice. He had lots of friends to play with, but then the reporters talk to his parents, and they find out that he didn't have a lot of friends, that he didn't play outside. And that sort of carries over in all aspects of the Ted Bundy story, is you have his version of the story, and then you have what actually happened. And when you fit those two together, you get more of an understanding about exactly how big the difference is between him and hopefully us. One of the most disturbing features that the series actually provides in really showing how distorted and how janked someone's upstairs can get is they showed Ted Bundy in the trials on video, because this was effectively the trial of the century. What you see in these videos and from the different tales of all the different law enforcement officers and people who interacted with him is how he's able to switch from calm and composed and like a fun guy and just a cool former law student to some crazy animal clawing at the bars of his cage trying to get his way, and then right back. So every one of us, when we lose control at that breaking point, we can all have a moment, a little breakdown. And that's not crazy. Having someone go from composed and collected to just losing it, that's not crazy. That is normal for people to, when they're pushed to their breaking point, when they finally snap, for them to actually have that breaking point. That's a normal thing. But what is not normal is to be able to turn on a dime and to just go right back to calm and collected and totally fine. Going back and forth between those two things is like a really short little microdose of exactly what type of person we're watching the story about. That's a perfect example of why this is a story in the first place. When you get not only past the crimes themselves, but then you get to the actual person. And they follow the story all the way up to his death, which is by execution. And you get a good idea of what goes on in a person's mind. You get a good idea of what goes on in a person's mind who's about to be executed, as well as someone who is well aware of what they've done. And at the very end, documentary crew doesn't make the audience root for the execution. They show, actually, crowds of people who are standing outside of the execution chamber who are actually cheering. And they show those people, and you have this moment at the very end of the series where you have to ask yourself, how different, how far off did Ted Bundy stray from the path of being normal, being a sane human? Because he murdered people, yes, but you have crowds of people who are cheering for another person's death. And there is an extreme difference in the two, but it's still showing somewhat of an indifference for human life in either case. And so it really does not only examine the actions of an individual person who obviously had extreme issues in the head and was obviously taken over by something that was entirely evil, but it takes that and kind of sets it in saying, how do we make sure that we don't become this? How do you, as the viewer, make sure that you don't become Ted Bundy? Because Ted Bundy could have started off as one of those people outside the prison cheering for the death of an inmate. And that was my interpretation of it. But Ted Bundy Tapes, I gotta say, give it a 6 or a 7 out of 10. We'll go with 7 out of 10, because it was a pretty good watch. 7 out of 10, 4 episodes, hour and a half long each, 6 hours total. Don't watch it all in one sitting if you want to sleep that night. Alright, if you have any suggestions for what I should review in the future, or if you want to yell at me and tell me about how wrong I am and how awful I am, that's cool too. My DMs are open, at Cole Trumbull. Tweet at me. Please don't call me mean names because my mom follows that account. Thank you. Good night. Critic's Corner. Critic's Corner!